The sound of Molly Harrison's sister dying had been the keening wail of wind through the cabin's gaps, followed by silence that stretched like the Montana plains themselves. That was 3 months ago, in the spring of 1878. And now Molly stood at the dusty window of that same cabin watching her brother-in-law Thomas load saddlebags onto his horse with movements too deliberate to be innocent. She had been 22 when she arrived in Utica, Montana to help her pregnant sister Eleanor through the difficult last months of carrying twins. Eleanor had always been delicate, even as girls growing up in Philadelphia, and the harsh Montana territory had worn her down to shadows and coughs. The babies came too early. Eleanor bled too much. By dawn, Molly had lost her only sister and both tiny nephews who never drew a full breath. Thomas had stood in the corner of the bedroom watching his wife grow cold, and Molly had seen something shift behind his eyes that frightened her more than grief ever could. "You will stay," Thomas had said. Not asked, said. "Eleanor would have wanted you to keep the house." Molly had nowhere else to go. The journey from Philadelphia had taken the last of her savings, and letters from home told of her father's drinking and her mother's shame over daughters who could not marry well. So she stayed, cooking and cleaning, trying to ignore how Thomas watched her across the dinner table, how his fingers lingered when passing her things. This morning he had finally shown his true nature. "I have debts," Thomas said without preamble, as she kneaded bread dough, "significant debts. There is a traveling man, a merchant named Cyrus Webb. He deals in various commodities as he moves between territories. He will pay handsomely for a woman of your age and qualities." The words had not made sense at first. Molly had stared at him, flour dusting her hands, the domestic scene so at odds with what he was proposing. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "Deadly serious. He arrives this afternoon. You will go with him willingly, or I will have Sheriff Parker arrest you for theft. I have already prepared documents showing you stole Eleanor's jewelry. Your word against mine, and I am a respected landowner, while you are just a spinster from the East with no prospects." The bread dough had fallen from her trembling hands. "Thomas, please. Eleanor loved you. How can you do this?" "Eleanor is dead," he said flatly, "and the living have needs. Webb will treat you well enough if you are cooperative. Fight him, and your life will be considerably harder. The choice is yours, but you will be gone from here by sunset either way." Now, hours later, Molly pressed her palm against the rough glass and wondered if she should run. But run where? The nearest town was 30 miles across terrain she did not know. And she had no horse, no money, nothing but the calico dress on her body, and her sister's memory growing colder by the day. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon. 2 riders approached the cabin with the unhurried pace of men who knew no one would stop them. Molly's stomach twisted into knots that pulled tighter with each hoofbeat she could now hear. Thomas met them outside. Through the window, Molly watched him shake hands with a large man in a fine coat despite the June heat. His dark beard shot through with gray. That would be Cyrus Webb. The other man was younger, harder, with a rifle across his saddle and eyes that scanned the landscape with the wariness of someone used to trouble. An employee or guard, Molly assumed. Their voices carried through the thin cabin walls. "She is young, healthy." Webb's voice was cultured, almost pleasant. 22, strong, good teeth, clean. Thomas spoke about her like livestock, and Molly felt bile rise in her throat. "Any diseases? Madness in the family?" "None. She is educated, reads, and writes. Came from Philadelphia. Good breeding." Webb laughed. "Educated women can be troublesome, but they fetch better prices in certain markets. Very well, Harrison. We agreed on $200. $200. The price of her entire existence, her future, her freedom. Molly heard the cabin door open. She turned from the window, her spine straight despite the fear coursing through her veins. She would not cower. She would not give Thomas the satisfaction. Webb filled the doorway, assessing her with the cold calculation of a horse trader. "Miss Harrison, your brother-in-law has explained the situation. He has explained that he is a coward and a villain who dishonors my sister's memory with every breath," Molly said. her voice steady though her hands trembled behind her back. To her surprise, Webb smiled. Spirit, I like that. Some of my clients appreciate spirit. He turned to Thomas. She will do nicely. Where are her things? She has nothing of value. Take her as she stands. Molly's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. In the corner of the room sat the small trunk with Eleanor's few precious possessions, a hairbrush, a locket with a curl from each dead baby, a worn Bible. Molly had hoped to keep them, to have something of the sister she loved. But Thomas was already guiding Webb outside to complete their transaction. The hard-eyed guard entered the cabin. Up close, he was younger than she had thought, perhaps 30, with a scar along his jawline and movements that spoke of violence held carefully in check. You will come now, he said. His voice was flat, Midwestern, giving nothing away. And if I refuse? Then I will carry you. Webb pays me to ensure his acquisitions reach their destination. How you make the journey is your choice. Molly had no choices left. She walked past him, her head high, and climbed onto the spare horse they had brought. The saddle was worn but serviceable. At least they were not making her ride behind one of them like baggage. Thomas stood in the cabin doorway, counting bills with hands that should have been shaking with shame, but were steady as stone. Molly looked at him one final time. Eleanor died believing you loved her, she said. I hope that thought haunts you every day for the rest of your miserable life. If her words affected him, his face did not show it. He simply folded the money and went back inside, closing the door on 3 months of her grief and service. Webb mounted his fine black horse. We have a long ride ahead. Cooperation will make it easier for everyone. I am not a cruel man, Miss Harrison, but I am a businessman. Try to run, and you will be caught and restrained. Accept your circumstances, and you will find I can be quite reasonable. Molly said nothing. She had learned in the past hour that some men were beyond the reach of reason or mercy. They rode south from Utica as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. The guard rode behind her, his rifle a constant reminder of her captivity. Webb led the way, occasionally humming snatches of melody like they were on a Sunday ride rather than a kidnapping. The landscape rolled past, beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. Montana Territory was vast and wild, still more frontier than civilization despite the railroad reaching Helena a few years back. They passed abandoned homesteads, victims of harsh winters or failed dreams, and Molly wondered if she would leave her bones in this territory too. They made camp as darkness fell near a creek lined with cottonwoods. The guard, whom Webb called Pike, gathered wood for a fire while Webb prepared a surprisingly good meal from their provisions. Molly sat on a fallen log, her hands unbound but her spirit shackled by the reality that she was alone with 2 men in the wilderness with no hope of rescue. Eat, Webb said, offering her a tin plate of beans and salt pork. You will need your strength. Where are you taking me? Webb settled by the fire, his face thoughtful in the flickering light. I have a buyer in Virginia City, a saloon owner who wants a woman to manage his establishment, keep books, provide company for his better clients. You could do worse, Miss Harrison. He is wealthy and he does not tolerate his employees being mistreated. A saloon, Molly's voice was hollow. She understood what company for better clients meant. You are educated and refined. Those qualities have value beyond the obvious. Make yourself indispensable to him through your intelligence, and you might find the situation tolerable. Many women in the territories have far harder lives. The terrible thing was that he was not wrong. Molly had seen the worn-down wives of miners and ranchers aged beyond their years by endless work and childbearing. She had seen the desperate women in Utica who sold themselves for pennies. Thomas had taken everything from her, even the option of honorable poverty. Why? She asked quietly. Why do you do this? Buy and sell human beings? Webb was silent for a moment, watching the fire. I trade in many things, Miss Harrison. Goods, information, opportunities. I connect people who have something with people who want something. Your brother-in-law had debts, and a surplus woman in his household, my client in Virginia City has money and a need for someone with your particular qualities. I simply facilitate the exchange. I am not a thing to be traded. In the eyes of the law, perhaps not, but in practice? He shrugged. What protection does the law offer you? Your brother-in-law holds the deed to his property and the respect of his community. You have nothing and no one. The law is a luxury of the powerful, Miss Harrison. The rest of us must make do with the reality of what we can and cannot do. Pike returned with more wood, building up the fire against the gathering night chill. He had not spoken since they made camp, and his silence was somehow more unnerving than Webb's smooth rationalizations. Get some sleep, Webb said. We have a long ride tomorrow. Pike will take first watch. They had not bound her, Molly realized. They did not need to. Where would she run in the darkness? How far would she get before Pike caught her? She lay on the blanket they provided, staring up at stars that burned with cold indifference, and tried not to think about what waited for her in Virginia City. She must have slept, because she woke to Pike shaking her shoulder in the pre-dawn darkness. Get up. We leave soon. The second day was much like the first, endless miles of Montana territory rolling past while her future closed in with each hoofbeat. They stopped only to water the horses and eat brief meals. Webb occasionally tried to engage her in conversation, asking about Philadelphia, about books she had read, as if they were traveling companions rather than captor and captive. Molly answered in monosyllables or not at all. On the third day, they stopped in a small settlement barely more than a trading post and a handful of rough buildings. Webb went inside to conduct some business while Pike watched Molly from his position leaning against the hitching post. A woman emerged from the trading post, Native American, perhaps Crow based on her dress, with a basket of supplies. She glanced at Molly, and something in her eyes showed recognition of another woman in trouble. She approached slowly, speaking in accented English. You are prisoner? Molly nodded, casting a glance at Pike. He was watching but did not move. There is a man, the woman said quietly, tracking you. 3 hours behind, maybe less. A cowboy with a gray horse. He asks questions in each place you have stopped. Molly's heart leaped. Who is he? Did he give a name? No name, but he is angry. Determined. The woman pressed something into Molly's hand. A small knife, barely more than a paring blade. Hide this. Use it if you must. Come along, Pike said, straightening. The woman melted away, and Molly slipped the tiny knife into her boot, her heart pounding. Someone was following them. But who? And why? Thomas certainly had not sent anyone. Perhaps the sheriff, if Thomas had been fool enough to speak too freely about his transaction, or maybe just an outlaw who thought to steal Webb's property. The thought that she was property worth stealing made Molly sick, but any change in her circumstances might be an opportunity. She said nothing to Webb or Pike about the woman's words. Let them be surprised if this mysterious cowboy caught up to them. That night, camping in a hollow between hills, Molly lay awake listening. The wind moved through the grass like whispered secrets. An owl called in the distance. Pike sat by the dying fire, his rifle across his knees. Webb snored softly from his bedroll. Molly's hand crept to her boot, touching the small knife hidden there. It was not much of a weapon, but it was more than she had possessed that morning. She held onto it like hope, small and sharp and possibly futile. The fourth day dawned gray and threatening rain. They rode through country growing more mountainous, following a trail that Webb seemed to know well. In the afternoon, they stopped at a creek to water the horses. Molly knelt by the water, splashing her face when she heard Pike say quietly, "We are being followed." Webb turned in his saddle, scanning the landscape behind them. "Are you certain?" 3 hours back, maybe less. One rider. I caught sun reflecting off metal on that ridge. Damn. Webb's pleasant demeanor cracked. A lawman? Could be. Could be bounty hunter. Could be anyone. We will push hard for the next station. If we can reach Murphy's place before dark, we will have shelter and additional men if needed. They mounted quickly, and Webb set a punishing pace. Molly's legs ached from hours in the saddle, but she kept up, her mind racing. The mysterious cowboy was real and getting closer. The knowledge filled her with equal parts hope and fear. The station Webb mentioned turned out to be a fortified ranch house built against a hillside with corrals and outbuildings surrounded by a rough stockade. A man with a shotgun met them at the gate, recognized Webb, and waved them through. "Hiram," Webb said, dismounting, "I need shelter for the night and possibly assistance. We may have trouble on our trail." Hiram Murphy was a grizzled man in his 60s, hard as the land around him. He looked at Molly with eyes that had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "What kind of trouble?" "Unknown. Pike spotted a tail. Single rider." Murphy grunted. "Put your horses in the barn. The woman can sleep in the house. You and your man take the bunkhouse with my hands." The ranch house was rough but clean, and Murphy's Shoshone wife fed Molly a bowl of stew without comment. Molly sat at the wooden table, her body exhausted, but her mind alert. Through the window she could see Webb and Murphy talking in the yard, their postures tense. She was startled when Mrs. Murphy sat across from her, her dark eyes searching. "The cowboy who follows," she said quietly. "He was here 2 days ago, asked about travelers matching your description." Molly leaned forward. "What did he look like?" "Tall, young, very angry. He had good eyes, though, honest eyes. He paid me for information with coins, not promises. I told him which direction such travelers might go." "Why are you helping me?" Mrs. Murphy's face was impassive. "I know what it is to be property. Long ago, before Hiram, I help when I can." She rose and went to the fireplace, returning with a larger knife which she placed on the table. "Better than what you have in your boot. Keep it hidden. If the cowboy comes tonight, there will be shooting. In chaos, you might find opportunity." Molly closed her fingers around the knife handle. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet. You might die in what is coming, but die fighting, not like a rabbit." The night crept past with agonizing slowness. Molly lay on a pallet in the corner of the main room, the knife beneath her blanket, listening to every sound. Murphy and his ranch hands maintained watch. Webb and Pike stayed armed and alert in the bunkhouse. Everyone waited for something to happen. It came near midnight. The sound of a horse approaching fast, then stopping outside the stockade gate. A voice called out deep and commanding. "This is Deputy Marshal Duncan Quaid out of Helena. I am tracking 2 men who may have an abducted woman with them. Open your gate, Murphy. I know you are in there, and I know Webb is with you." Molly's breath caught. A deputy marshal. That was why he was pursuing them, but how had he known? Webb emerged from the bunkhouse, his voice carrying across the yard. "This is a private transaction, Marshal. I have documentation showing that the woman is sold legally by her legal guardian to settle debts. Thomas Harrison is her brother-in-law, not her guardian. And selling humans is illegal, Webb. You know that. So does every judge between here and Canada. The law is flexible on such matters in the territories. Not my law." The voice was hard as iron. "Send the woman out, and I will let you ride away. Keep her, and I will come in and take her. Your choice, but choose quickly." Murphy appeared on his porch, shotgun in hand. "I do not want trouble, Marshal. But Webb is paying for shelter, and I honor my agreements." "Then you will hang alongside him for kidnapping, Murphy. Is that what you want? Is it worth it?" There was a long silence. Molly crept to the window, peering through a gap in the shutter. In the moonlight, she could see a man on a gray horse outside the gate, tall in the saddle, his face shadowed by his hat. Her rescuer, if she survived the next few minutes. Webb made his decision. "Take him." Gunfire shattered the night. Molly dropped to the floor, her heart hammering. Bullets thudded into wood, glass shattered, men shouted. The marshal's rifle answered from outside, each shot placed with precision. One of Murphy's men cried out and fell from the stockade walkway. Molly seized her moment. While everyone was focused on the fight, she crawled toward the door, the knife gripped in her hand. Mrs. Murphy appeared in the doorway to the back room, saw Molly, and nodded once. The shooting was concentrated near the gate. Molly slipped out the back door into the chaos of the yard. Smoke from gunpowder hazed the air. She could see Pike crouched behind a water trough, firing toward the gate. Webb was in the bunkhouse doorway, reloading. The barn. If she could reach the barn, maybe steal a horse in the confusion. Molly ran, her boots pounding dirt, expecting at any moment to feel a bullet tear through her back. She made it to the barn and ducked inside. The horses were panicked by the gunfire, stamping and snorting. Molly found Webb's black horse, the best of the lot, and began saddling it with shaking hands. The barn door flew open. Pike stood silhouetted against the moonlight, his rifle pointed at her. "Step away from the horse," he said. Molly's hand tightened on the knife hidden in her skirt folds. "No." "I will shoot you. Do not test me." "Then shoot me. At least I will die free." For a moment they stood frozen, his rifle and her tiny knife. The absurd inequality of their weapons, a perfect metaphor for everything that had brought her to this moment. Then Pike lowered his rifle slightly. "Go," he said. "Ride north. Stay off the main trail." Molly stared at him. "Why?" "Because I'm tired," he said. "Just go before I change my mind." She did not wait. She swung onto the horse and kicked it into motion, bursting from the barn at a gallop. Shots rang out, but whether they were aimed at her or still part of the battle at the gate, she could not tell. She leaned low over the horse's neck and rode like her life depended on it, because it did. Behind her, the gunfire intensified, then suddenly stopped. Molly risked a glance back and saw flames. The bunkhouse was burning. In the firelight, figures struggled, but she was too far away now to see details. She rode through the night, following the creek north, as Pike had said, her body aching and her mind reeling. The marshal, this Duncan Quaid, had he survived? Had he killed Webb? What would happen now? Dawn found her exhausted and lost, the horse winded beneath her. She had no idea where she was, only that she had put miles between herself and Murphy Station. She dismounted by a spring and let the horse drink while she splashed water on her face and tried to think. The sound of hoofbeats made her spin, reaching for the knife. A gray horse emerged from the trees, and on its back was the man who had come for her. Deputy Marshal Duncan Quaid was younger than she expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. Blood stained his left sleeve, and his face was lined with exhaustion, but he sat straight in the saddle with the bearing of a man who did not know how to quit. He reined in the gray horse and looked at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Molly Harrison?" he finally asked. "Yes. Are you truly a deputy marshal?" He reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a badge, the metal catching the morning light. "Duncan Quaid, out of Helena. I have been tracking you for 5 days." Molly's legs suddenly felt weak. She sat down hard on a rock. "How did you know? How did you find me?" Duncan dismounted carefully, favoring his wounded arm. "I stopped in Utica on my way south from Fort Benton. I was having a drink at the saloon when your brother-in-law came in, celebrating his good fortune. He was drunk and running his mouth about how he had solved his financial problems. A few people looked uncomfortable, but nobody was going to challenge him. He is a respected landowner." "And you did?" "I asked questions. The bartender told me about your sister dying, about you staying on to help. Other people filled in details. When I asked Thomas directly what had happened to you, he got defensive and told me to mind my own business. That is usually when I know there is something worth investigating." He checked his horse, running his hands over its legs with the automatic care of a man who depended on his mount. "I rode out to his cabin. He tried to run me off his property. I insisted. He finally admitted he had sold you to Cyrus Webb to settle debts. He seemed to think there was nothing wrong with that. You came after me." Molly's voice was small. "You barely knew I existed and you came after me." Duncan looked at her, his gray eyes direct. "It is my job. More than that, it is what is right. Nobody deserves to be sold like livestock, and the law does not allow it, no matter what justifications men like Thomas Harrison and Cyrus Webb dream up." "Is Webb dead?" "Yes. He drew on me during the fight. I had no choice." Duncan's face was grim. Murphy and his men surrendered once Webb went down. Pike ran off in the chaos. "The sheriff from the nearest town will handle Murphy and his crew." Molly absorbed this. The man who had bought her was dead. Her brother-in-law's carefully laid plans had come to nothing. She was free. If freedom meant being alone and destitute in the Montana wilderness. "What happens now?" she asked. Duncan pulled a canteen from his saddle and offered it to her. The water was warm but tasted like salvation. "Now I take you back to Helena. You will need to give testimony about what happened. Thomas Harrison will be arrested and tried. Beyond that." He hesitated. "What do you want to happen?" It was such a simple question, but Molly had not been asked what she wanted in so long that she had almost forgotten she was allowed to want anything. Tears suddenly blurred her vision, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, refusing to cry in front of this stranger who had saved her life. Duncan seemed to understand. He busied himself checking his wounded arm, unwrapping the makeshift bandage to reveal a long gash, bloody but not deep. "Bullet grazed me. I have had worse." "You need that cleaned and stitched properly," Molly said, grateful for something practical to focus on. "Do you have medical supplies?" "Some. I am not much of a hand with needle and thread, though." "I am. Let me help." She cleaned and stitched the wound with supplies from his saddlebag, her hands steady despite everything. Duncan bore it without complaint, only a tightening around his eyes showing the pain. This close, she could see the scar on his chin was old, probably from childhood. His hands were calloused from work, his face weathered by sun and wind. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, but more importantly, he was competent and calm, someone who had ridden into danger for a woman he did not know because it was the right thing to do. "Thank you," he said when she finished binding the wound. "You did a better job than the last doctor I saw." "My sister was often ill. I learned to manage basic medical care." "I am sorry about Eleanor, about everything Thomas put you through." The sympathy in his voice nearly undid her. Molly turned away, blinking back tears. "We should go." "You said Helena?" "It is a 3-day ride if we take it steady. Are you up for that?" "I have no choice, do I?" "You always have choices, Miss Harrison. You could head east, try to return to Philadelphia. You could go west to the coast. You could stay in Montana and build a new life. I am offering to escort you to Helena and help you see justice done, but the decision is yours." Molly looked at him, this stranger who had become her salvation. "What is Helena like?" "It is a mining town mostly, but growing fast. The railroad comes through, so it is connected to the rest of the world. There are good people there, and opportunities for someone willing to work. I know some families who might take on a housekeeper or teacher. You said you are educated?" "I can read and write in English and French. I know arithmetic and basic accounting. I am a fair cook and I can sew." "Then you will find work easily enough." Duncan swung back onto his gray horse. "Come on. We should put more distance between us and Murphy's station before we stop for the day." They rode through the morning and into the afternoon, following game trails and creek beds rather than established roads. Duncan navigated with the ease of someone who knew the land intimately, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. He talked as they rode, filling the silence with stories of his work as a deputy marshal, the places he had been, the people he had helped. Molly found herself relaxing incrementally, the knot of terror that had lived in her stomach for days slowly loosening. Duncan made no demands on her, kept a respectful distance, treated her as a person rather than property or burden. It was such a basic thing, common decency, but after Thomas and Webb, it felt like luxury. They made camp that evening in a sheltered canyon with good water and grazing for the horses. Duncan proved to be an efficient camp maker, soon having a fire going and coffee brewing. Molly contributed by preparing a meal from their combined supplies, creating something better than trail rations. As they ate, Duncan said, "Tell me about Philadelphia. What was your life like there?" It was the first time anyone had asked about her life as if it mattered. Molly found herself talking about her childhood, her parents, her sister. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. She told him about Eleanor's courtship with Thomas, how charming he had seemed, how none of them had suspected the cruelty beneath the surface. She talked about the journey west, about watching her sister fade, about the terrible night when Eleanor died. Duncan listened with the kind of attention that was itself a gift, asking questions that showed he was truly hearing her. In turn, he told her about growing up on a ranch in Wyoming, about losing his parents to winter fever when he was 19, about drifting for a few years before finding his calling in law enforcement. "I like helping people," he said simply. "I'm good at tracking. Good in a fight when necessary, good at solving problems. The marshal's office lets me use those skills for something that matters." "You could have been killed at Murphy's Station. Was one woman worth that risk?" Duncan met her eyes across the fire. "Every person is worth that risk. The moment we start deciding some lives matter less than others, we lose our humanity. Besides," he added, with a slight smile, "I did not plan on getting killed. I am fairly hard to kill, as it turns out." Molly found herself smiling back. It felt strange, using those muscles after days of fear and misery. "Thank you, Marshal Quaid. I know I have said it before, but thank you for coming after me, for seeing me as worth saving." "Duncan," he said. "Just Duncan is fine. And you do not need to thank me for doing my job." "I think you do more than your job requires." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "Get some rest. We have a long day tomorrow." Molly lay in her bedroll watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to Duncan's steady breathing as he slept on the other side of the dying fire. For the first time since Eleanor died, she felt something approaching safe. The next 2 days passed in steady travel. They saw few people, just the vast Montana landscape rolling past in waves of grass and stone and sky. Duncan proved to be easy company, neither talking too much nor falling into oppressive silence. He taught her to better read the land, pointing out signs of water and weather. She mended a tear in his shirt and improved their meals with wild greens she recognized from her nursing training. They were comfortable together, Molly realized. Despite the circumstances of their meeting, despite the violence and fear, something was forming between them that felt natural and right. She caught herself watching him as he rode ahead, noting the strong line of his shoulders, the capable way he handled both horse and terrain. She wondered what it would be like to have a man like this in her life by choice, not circumstance. Someone who saw her as an equal, someone who listened when she spoke. On the third day, Helena appeared in the distance, sprawling across a valley with the mountains rising behind it. The town was larger than Molly expected, with several church steeples visible, and the geometric grid of streets suggesting permanent settlement rather than temporary camp. "Last Chance Gulch," Duncan said, gesturing toward the main street. "That is where the big gold strike was back in 1864, 12 years later, and the town is still growing. The territorial capital might move here from Virginia City if the politicians can agree." They rode down Main Street in the afternoon sunshine, and Molly was acutely aware of the looks they drew. A woman travel-worn and riding astride, accompanied by a deputy marshal, clearly had a story. Duncan ignored the stares and led them to a modest but well-kept hotel. "I will get you a room," he said, "on my account. You can rest, clean up, and tomorrow we will go to the marshal's office and start the legal process. I have no money to repay you. I am not asking you to." Duncan swung down from his horse and offered his hand to help her dismount. His grip was warm and steady. "This is part of the job, making sure victims are taken care of. Marshal Blackburn will approve the expense." The hotel owner, a round woman with kind eyes, showed Molly to a small room with an actual bed, a washstand, and curtains on the window. After a week of sleeping on the ground, it seemed impossibly luxurious. The woman brought up hot water and soap, and Molly washed away days of trail dust and fear, scrubbing her skin until it was pink and sore. She had only the one calico dress, dirty and torn now, but she did her best to clean and mend it. Looking at herself in the small mirror, she saw a stranger, thinner than she remembered, her face drawn, her eyes holding shadows that had not been there a month ago. She was changed, marked by what had happened, and she would never again be the naive woman who had come west to help her sister. That evening, Duncan took her to a small restaurant and bought her the first real meal she had eaten in days. Over roast beef and potatoes, he explained what would happen next. "We will file formal charges against Thomas Harrison for illegal sale of a person, fraud, and whatever else the prosecutor can make stick. You will need to give testimony. It might be difficult, recounting everything, but it is necessary. Will I have to go back to Utica? Probably, for the trial, but I will be with you. I will not let anything happen to you." Molly believed him. In just 3 days of knowing Duncan Quaid, she had learned that he was a man of his word. "What happens after the trial, to me, I mean?" Duncan set down his fork, his expression serious. "That depends on what you want. I spoke to a few people today while you were resting. There is a widow named Mrs. Patterson who runs a boarding house. She needs help managing it, and she said she would be willing to take you on with room and board plus a small wage. It is honest work, respectable." "That sounds wonderful," Molly said, and meant it. The chance to work, to earn her own way, to not be dependent on cruel relatives or at the mercy of men like Webb, it was more than she had dared hope for. "There is also," Duncan continued, looking slightly uncomfortable, "a school teacher position opening up in the fall. The current teacher is getting married and moving to Butte. The school board would need to interview you, but with your education you would be a strong candidate. It pays better than housekeeping." "You have been busy on my behalf." "I like to solve problems completely." He met her eyes. "You have been through hell, Molly. You deserve a chance to build a real life, not just survive." The use of her first name sent a flutter through her chest. "Thank you, Duncan." Over the next few days, Molly settled into a strange new routine. She gave her formal statement to Marshal Blackburn, a grizzled veteran who listened to her story with increasing anger at Thomas Harrison's actions. She met with the prosecutor, a sharp young man who assured her they had a strong case. She moved into Mrs. Patterson's boarding house and began learning the work of managing it. Duncan was a constant presence through it all, checking on her daily, making sure she had what she needed. He took her to meet members of the school board, introducing her with quiet confidence in her abilities. He escorted her to church on Sunday, silencing gossip simply by his presence and obvious respect for her. Molly found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that surprised her. When he knocked on the boarding house door, her heart would lift. When he smiled at something she said, warmth would spread through her chest. She told herself it was gratitude, natural affection for someone who had saved her life. But late at night, lying in her small room, she admitted it was more than that. She was falling in love with Duncan Quaid. It was foolish, probably. They had known each other less than 2 weeks. Their acquaintance had been forged in violence and trauma, hardly the foundation for lasting affection. He was a deputy marshal with a dangerous job, and she was a woman trying to rebuild a shattered life. There were 1,000 practical reasons why she should guard her heart. But when Duncan looked at her with those steady gray eyes, when he spoke to her like her thoughts and opinions mattered, when he unconsciously reached to help her over rough ground or ensure she was comfortable, Molly felt something she had never experienced before. Not the desperate attachment of needing rescue, but genuine admiration and attraction for who he was as a person. She wondered if he felt any of the same. He was unfailingly proper with her, never crossing lines of propriety, but sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Once, when she laughed at something he said, she saw his face light up with such pleasure that she wondered if making her happy had become important to him. 3 weeks after their arrival in Helena, word came that Thomas Harrison had been arrested and would be transported to Helena to stand trial. Duncan brought Molly the news at the boarding house where she was helping Mrs. Patterson prepare dinner for the residents. "He will arrive next week," Duncan said. He has retained a lawyer from Butte, so he is taking this seriously. Are you prepared to face him? Molly set down the potatoes she had been peeling. I have to be, do I not? He needs to answer for what he did. He does. But I know it will not be easy for you. Duncan hesitated, then continued. I want you to know that I will be there. In the courtroom, I mean. As both a witness and as your friend, if you will let me be that. You are already my friend, Duncan. You are the best friend I've ever had, if I'm honest. Molly wiped her hands on her apron. Can we walk? I need some air. They strolled through Helena's streets in the long summer evening, the mountains gilded with sunset light. Other couples walked together, families sat on porches, children played in the dusty roads. It was so normal, so peaceful, and Molly felt a pang of longing for this to be her life. Not a temporary refuge, but a true home. Have you thought about the teaching position? Duncan asked. The school board is very interested. They said you made an excellent impression. I have thought about it. It seems like a dream, honestly, to have meaningful work, to help children learn, to be independent. Molly paused. Do you think I can do it? After everything that happened, can I just go on and build a normal life? Duncan stopped walking and turned to face her. Molly, you are one of the strongest people I have ever met. You survived being sold like property. You escaped during a gunfight. You rode all night through country you did not know. You did not fall apart. You did not give up. Teaching children seems like something you could do in your sleep after all that. I do not feel strong. I feel broken. You are not broken. His voice was firm. You are wounded, and that is not the same thing. Wounds heal, especially in people with your courage. Molly looked up at him. This man who had become the center of her world so quickly and made a decision. Life was too short and too uncertain to hide what she felt. Duncan, I need to tell you something. He waited, his full attention on her. I know we have not known each other long, Molly continued, her heart pounding. I know the circumstances of how we met were terrible, but you have become very important to me. More than just the man who saved me. I admire you. I enjoy your company. I find myself thinking about you constantly. I am trying to say that I have developed feelings for you, and I needed you to know even if you do not feel the same way. Duncan's expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then slowly, he smiled, and it transformed his usually serious face. Molly, I have been half in love with you since you threatened to fight Pike with that little knife hidden in your skirt. I saw your courage that day, and everything since has only made me care for you more. I did not want to speak because I thought it might be unfair, you being grateful and maybe confusing that with something else. I did not want to take advantage. You could never take advantage of me. You have treated me with nothing but respect and kindness. Then yes, Duncan said, reaching for her hand. Yes, I care for you very much, more than I have cared for anyone. I wake up thinking about whether you slept well, whether you are happy. I go to sleep remembering things you said, the way you laugh. If you are asking whether I want to court you properly, the answer is absolutely yes. Joy flooded through Molly, so intense it was almost painful. She squeezed his hand. I am asking exactly that. Duncan raised her hand and kissed it gently, his eyes never leaving hers. Then it would be my honor, Miss Harrison. They walked back to the boarding house holding hands like young sweethearts, talking about everything and nothing, planning a future that had seemed impossible just weeks before. At the door, Duncan kissed her cheek with careful propriety, then left with a promise to return the next day. Mrs. Patterson was waiting in the parlor with a knowing smile. That Marshall is a good man, she said. Treat him well. I intend to, Molly replied, still floating on happiness. The next week, Thomas Harrison arrived in Helena in chains. Molly steeled herself to face him at the courthouse, wearing a new dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, her hair carefully pinned, her spine straight. Duncan stood beside her, a solid presence, his hand occasionally brushing hers in silent support. Thomas looked diminished somehow, his bluster gone. replaced by the bitter anger of a man whose plans had failed. When he saw Molly, his face twisted. "You have ruined me," he hissed as the guards led him past. "Eleanor would be ashamed of you." "Eleanor would be ashamed of you," Molly replied, her voice steady. "She loved you, and you dishonored her memory by selling her sister like livestock. You are the ruin here, Thomas, and you did it to yourself." The trial lasted 3 days. Molly testified about being sold, about the journey with Webb, about the terror of those days. Duncan testified about his investigation, about the fight at Murphy's station, about tracking Molly down. Other witnesses corroborated details. Thomas's lawyer tried to argue that Thomas had authority over Molly as her brother-in-law, that the transaction was a legitimate debt settlement, but the prosecutor demolished those arguments. On the 3rd day, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced Thomas Harrison to 5 years in territorial prison and ordered him to pay restitution to Molly, though everyone knew she would likely never see that money. Walking out of the courthouse, Molly felt something release in her chest. It was over. Thomas would answer for what he did. She was truly free. Duncan took her to dinner that night at Helena's best restaurant, a celebration of justice and new beginnings. Over wine and good food, they talked about the future. "The school board has formally offered you the teaching position," Duncan said, "starting in September. Will you take it?" "Yes," Molly said without hesitation. "I want to build a life here, Duncan. A real life, not just survival." "I am glad." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Because I want to be part of that life, if you will have me. I want nothing more." Over the following months, they courted properly. Duncan would call at the boarding house in the evenings, and they would walk through Helena's streets or sit on the porch talking. On Sundays, they attended church together, then had dinner at one of the restaurants or increasingly at the boarding house where Molly would cook for him and Mrs. Patterson. Duncan taught her to ride better, taking her on excursions into the mountains. Molly introduced him to poetry and books, reading to him in the evenings. They picnicked by mountain streams, attended town social events, and slowly built a relationship based not on drama and rescue, but on genuine companionship and deepening love. In September, Molly began teaching at the Helena School. She loved it immediately, the children eager to learn, the satisfaction of seeing understanding dawn in their eyes. She was good at it, patient and creative, and the school board congratulated themselves on their excellent hire. Duncan was often away on marshal business, tracking criminals and maintaining order across Montana territory, but he always returned to Helena, to Molly. His absences were hard, but they made the reunions sweeter. Each time he rode back into town, Molly's heart would leap at the sight of his gray horse, and she would run to meet him with unfeigned joy. On a crisp October evening, Duncan took Molly riding up into the mountains to watch the aspens turn gold. They dismounted near a high meadow with a view that stretched for miles, the world painted in autumn glory. "Molly," Duncan said, taking her hands in his, "it has been 6 months since I found you in the wilderness. 6 months since the worst day of your life led to us meeting. I do not believe in fate, but I believe in second chances. I believe in choosing to build something good out of bad circumstances." He dropped to one knee, and Molly's breath caught. "I love you," Duncan continued. "I love your courage, your kindness, your intelligence. I love how you laugh, how you think, how you face the world. I love the life we are building together. I know the past still hurts sometimes, and I cannot promise you an easy future as a marshal's wife. But I promise to love you, to respect you, to stand beside you for as long as I live. Molly Harrison, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Molly's face, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, Duncan, I will marry you. I love you so much." He stood and kissed her properly this time, and it felt like coming home, like the end of a long journey and the beginning of something even better. They married in November in Helena's church, with half the town attending. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears. Marshal Blackburn gave the bride away since Molly had no family present. The school board members attended, as did Duncan's fellow deputies and dozens of people whose lives Duncan had touched through his work. Molly wore a dress of deep blue, and Duncan wore his best suit. When they exchanged vows, speaking clearly and firmly, there was not a dry eye in the church. Everyone present knew their story, knew what they had overcome to reach this moment. Duncan bought them a small house on the edge of Helena, with a view of the mountains and space for a garden. Molly continued teaching, and Duncan continued his work as a deputy marshal, but they built a home together filled with laughter and love and the thousand small intimacies of a good marriage. In the spring of 1879, Molly discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror, memories of Eleanor's death still sharp. But Duncan was steadfast in his support, and the doctor assured her she was healthy and strong. Their son was born in December, a healthy baby with dark hair and his father's gray eyes. They named him Elliot Duncan Quaid, and Molly held him and wept with relief and love. Duncan sat beside the bed, one arm around Molly and one finger gripped by his son's tiny hand, his face showing wonder at the family he had never expected to have. The years flowed past in the way of happy lives. Molly taught for 3 more years before their second child, a daughter they named Eleanor Marie, was born. A third child, another son they called James, arrived 2 years after that. The house echoed with children's voices, with laughter and the occasional fight, with bedtime stories, and Duncan teaching the boys to ride while Molly taught their daughter to read. Duncan advanced to senior deputy marshal, his reputation for integrity and competence growing. He was home more as he took on administrative duties, training younger deputies and handling cases in Helena itself. The work was still dangerous sometimes, but Molly had long since made peace with her fear, trusting in Duncan's skill and caution. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they returned to that high meadow where Duncan had proposed. It was autumn again, the aspens brilliant gold, the air sharp with coming winter. Their children were with Mrs. Patterson for the day, and they had these hours to themselves. "Do you ever regret it?" Molly asked, leaning against Duncan as they watched the sunset paint the mountains. "The dangerous life I brought into your world? The complications?" Duncan pulled her closer. "Not for 1 second. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You and our children, our life together, it is everything I never knew I wanted." "I feel the same." Molly turned in his arms to face him. "Thomas meant to destroy me when he sold me to Webb. He meant to profit from my suffering, but instead his cruelty led me to you. It led me to a better life than I ever could have imagined in Philadelphia." "Do you think about those days much? About what happened?" "Sometimes. Less as the years pass. The memories are there, but they do not control me anymore. I am not that frightened woman being hauled across Montana against her will. I am a wife, a mother, a teacher. I am free." "You were always free," Duncan said softly. "You just needed the chance to prove it." They kissed as the sun set. 2 people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and built something beautiful from the wreckage. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their happiness. In 1889, Montana became a state rather than a territory. By then, Duncan was the chief marshal for the region, respected and influential. Molly had returned to teaching part-time as their children grew older, and she had started advocating for better education across the state. She spoke at meetings, wrote letters to newspapers, and used her own story to argue for laws protecting women from exploitation. Thomas Harrison had died in prison in 1882, unmourned and largely forgotten. Molly had felt nothing at the news, not satisfaction or grief, just relief that a chapter was finally closed completely. Their children grew into fine young adults. Elliot studied law in Helena, then returned to practice there. Eleanor married a rancher and had children of her own. James joined the growing Montana State Police Force, following in his father's footsteps. In 1895, on a warm summer evening, Duncan and Molly sat on the porch of their house, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Duncan's hair was gray now, and lines marked Molly's face, but their hands still fit together perfectly, and their love had only deepened with the years. "Do you remember when I first saw you by that spring?" Duncan asked. "You looked so fierce, so ready to fight even though you were exhausted and terrified." "I remember. You looked like salvation riding a gray horse." Molly smiled. "I fell a little bit in love with you right then, though I did not know it yet. I knew I would do anything to keep you safe. That feeling never went away." "You did more than keep me safe. You gave me a life worth living. You gave me love, family, purpose. You saw me as a person worth saving, and that changed everything." One of their grandchildren, Elliot's daughter Margaret, ran up to the porch. "Grandmother, tell us the story again, about how grandfather rescued you from the bad men." Molly gathered the child onto her lap. The story had become family legend, told and retold, simplified for young ears but never losing its essential truth. "A long time ago," Molly began, "when Montana was still a territory and very wild, I found myself in terrible trouble. Bad people wanted to hurt me. I was frightened and alone. But then your grandfather, who was a brave deputy marshal, came riding after me on his gray horse. He fought the bad men and he saved me, and then he made sure I was safe and taken care of. And along the way we fell in love." "Like a fairy tale," Margaret breathed. "Like a fairy tale," Molly agreed. "Except it was real. And sometimes real life is even better than fairy tales because you get to live it every day." Duncan reached over and took Molly's free hand. "Best decision I ever made, going after you. Best thing that ever happened to me, you finding me." The summer evening deepened to dusk. Children played, grandchildren laughed, and two people who had found each other in darkness sat together in the light they had built, grateful for every moment, every choice, every day that had led them here. Years later, when both were old and tired but still together, they would tell anyone who asked that theirs was a love story that began with injustice but ended with joy. That sometimes the worst moments of life could lead to the best, if you were brave enough to keep going, to keep hoping, to keep believing that somewhere in the darkness, someone might be riding toward you, determined to make things right. And in the end, that was exactly what had happened. In the wild Montana territory of 1878, a woman had been sold like property, and a man had refused to accept that injustice. Their paths had crossed in violence and fear, but they had chosen to build something better. They had chosen each other again and again through decades of life together. On a cold morning in December 1905, Duncan Quaid died peacefully in his sleep, his hand clasped in Molly's. She sat beside him for a long time, remembering the young marshal who had come for her all those years ago, who had given her back her freedom and then offered her his heart. Molly lived 3 more years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling stories of the old Montana territory and the man who had saved her life and then made it worth living. When she passed in the spring of 1908, she was buried beside Duncan on a hill overlooking Helena, the mountains they had both loved rising eternal in the distance. Their headstones were simple, just names and dates, but the family placed a plaque between them with words Molly had written years before. "Here lie 2 souls who found each other in darkness and built a life filled with light. May their love be remembered always." And it was remembered. Their descendants told the story to each generation. The tale of how Duncan Quaid tracked down and freed Molly Harrison from those who would harm her, and how from that rescue grew a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. It became part of Montana's history, a reminder that even in the wild and often brutal frontier, there were people who chose kindness, who fought for justice, who believed that every person mattered and deserved to be free. The story of Molly and Duncan was a story of the Wild West at its best. Not the violence or the lawlessness that often dominated tales of that era, but the courage, the determination, and the fundamental decency that could emerge when people chose to do what was right regardless of the cost. It was a love story forged in fire and tested by hardship, made stronger by the trials they overcame together. In the end, Thomas Harrison's cruelty had failed completely. He had meant to destroy Molly, to use her for his own gain, but instead he had inadvertently set in motion events that led her to happiness beyond anything she could have imagined. His name was forgotten by all but historians, while Molly and Duncan were remembered with love by everyone who knew their story. That was perhaps the greatest justice of all, that evil had failed and good had triumphed, not in some abstract way, but in the very concrete reality of 2 lives lived fully. 3 children raised with love, and generations of descendants who carried forward the values Duncan and Molly had embodied. They had taken the worst life could throw at them and transformed it into something beautiful, and that legacy would outlast any monument of stone or metal. The house in Helena stood for many years after, a landmark in the growing city, and people would point it out to visitors. "That is where Marshal Quaid and his wife lived," they would say. "He saved her from kidnappers back in the territorial days, and they built a life together that was the envy of everyone who knew them. True love, the kind that lasts." And children would listen wide-eyed, imagining the adventure, the romance, the triumph of good over evil. Some of those children would grow up to be lawmen and women, inspired by Duncan's example. Others would become teachers like Molly, wanting to make a difference in their communities. And still others would simply remember that love was possible even in the darkest times, that 2 people could find each other against all odds and build something lasting. The Wild West was a time of great change and challenge, of fortunes won and lost, of violence and beauty existing side by side. In the midst of that turbulent era, countless stories unfolded, most forgotten by history, but some stories endured because they captured something essential about the human spirit, about the capacity for courage and love and redemption. The story of how Duncan Quaid tracked down and freed Molly Harrison, and how that act of justice became the foundation for a lifetime of love, was one of those stories that deserved to be remembered. It spoke to the best of what people could be, the highest ideals of the law Duncan had served and the personal dignity Molly had fought to preserve. Their love had been tested by circumstances that would have destroyed weaker bonds, but it had emerged stronger, deeper, more resilient. They had shown that real love was not just passion or romance, though they had shared both, but partnership, respect, and the daily choice to honor and support each other through whatever life brought. As Montana changed from wild territory to settled state, as the frontier gave way to civilization, the values Duncan and Molly represented became even more important. Their story reminded people that progress was not just about railroads and industry, but about justice, about treating all people with dignity, about refusing to accept cruelty, even when it was convenient or profitable to do so. And so their story lived on, passed down through generations, a testament to love and courage in the American West. It began with a woman being sold against her will, continued with a man determined to right that wrong, and ended with 2 people who chose each other every day for more than 40 years. In between was a life fully lived, children raised, work accomplished, love given and received without measure. That was the true ending of their story, not in death, but in the legacy they left behind, the lives they touched, the example they set. Long after Helena, Montana grew from a mining town into a modern city, long after the Wild West passed into history and legend, people still told the story of Marshal Duncan Quaid and his beloved wife Molly, and how their love story began with an act of rescue and became something that inspired everyone who heard it. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope was possible, that injustice could be overcome, that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that 2 people, if they were brave enough and committed enough, could build something beautiful out of even the worst beginning. And perhaps that was the real message of their story, the reason it endured when so many others faded from memory. It was not just a tale of adventure in the Old West, though it was that. It was not just a romance, though the love between Duncan and Molly was deep and true. It was a story about choosing to be better, to do better, to believe that every person mattered and that love was worth fighting for. In a time when women had few rights and fewer protections, Duncan had seen Molly as a person deserving of justice and respect. In a time when survival often meant hardening your heart, Molly had kept hers open enough to love again after terrible trauma. Together they had shown that the Wild West, for all its harshness, could also be a place where people of courage and integrity could build lives of meaning and joy. Their descendants carried that legacy forward, telling the story to each new generation, keeping alive the memory of two people who had met in the worst possible circumstances and made from it something wonderful. The story became part of Montana's folklore, a piece of the state's history that people took pride in. Proof that even in the rough and tumble frontier days there had been people who cared about justice and love and doing the right thing. And so the story of Molly and Duncan lived on, a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West and enduring long after that era passed into history. It was a story with a happy ending, the kind of ending everyone deserves but not everyone gets, the kind of ending that makes all the struggles worthwhile. They had found each other against all odds, built a life together through all challenges, and loved each other until the very end. What more could anyone ask from life than that? What better legacy could anyone leave than the memory of a love that overcame everything and endured through the years? In the end, that was their gift to all who heard their story, the knowledge that love was possible, that justice could prevail, that courage would be rewarded, and that even the worst beginning could lead to the happiest of endings. It was a gift they gave freely, a story they lived authentically, and a legacy that would never be forgotten as long as there were people who believed in the power of love and the importance of fighting for what was right.